Welcome to all of you. My name is Larry Arn. I work at the college, and I want to give you a special welcome, and I want to say thanks for something great done for us lately that affects this event. The AWC Foundation in Nashville, led by Andrea Waite Carlton and Steve Rasmussen, actually administers the foundation, have given an endowment gift so that we can have these lectures. And that means stock market behaving and the world not collapsing. They'll probably go on for a long time. That's a great gift. Probably some of the speakers will be invited to go down to Nashville where they live because they want to meet the speakers and also share them with their neighbors down there in Nashville. And Andrea and Steve will probably be up here sometimes, and we look forward to welcoming them at the Kirby Center. And they're going to watch a tape of this. Thank you very, very much. Andrea is a tremendous person, very smart, full of faith, very tough, just the kind we like. The lectures are important because they're what we do. We hold a view here at the college that we're in the middle of a great debate. Enormous choices of universal significance are pending in the country. The meaning of America is so clear, it is the most coherently founded country in all of history. It has a birthday. The birthday begins with a document that explains what the country is all about. And today there's an argument about that. Today we have new purposes, and those new purposes, which have transformed the government, it's a different looking thing than it used to be, a different functioning thing, different entirely in size and scope, and it too has reasons. And those reasons can be looked up. You can find them, for example, in our Constitution Reader, published by Hillsdale College at reasonable cost. And all of the great tracts that justify the modern liberal bureaucratic state are reproduced there. Examples of the highest and most important reasoning that led us where we are. And that reasoning goes on today, all the time. Not always well. David Bobb lately pointed me to a publication of the, what's it called, the Center for American Progress, where they associate modern liberalism with Alexander Hamilton especially, and with the founders. And this piece of writing is articulate and good, and thank God for the existence of it. I argue that it just needs one more thing to be entirely persuasive. It needs to be true. And isn't that great? We can have a discussion about that because, of course, the things I'm saying right now, if they become known to those people, they're going to argue that there's just one thing about what I'm saying, and that is it needs to be true. And that raises the question, which is true? And that is the choice. Now, we in this room, nor any small group of people, however motivated, however diligent, however wise, are not, according to the principles of the United States, empowered to make the choice. We do not get to make the choice. We ought not to make the choice and ought not to think that we can. That is a choice for the American people. Our function is to equip them to make the choice by trying to make the argument as good as it can be, as clear as it can be. And of course that begins with what happens right here in this room, and also what happens in those classrooms that gaggle of boys and girls sitting right over there have to go back to in August, where they will be tortured until they understand. And there's just a few of us in this room, and there's just a few of us in those classrooms. And that is very important because that contributes to the purity and excellence of what goes on in those places. But on the other hand, we are blessed at the college to have the means to make that activity radiate. And it does go everywhere. We have a publication that goes to close to 3 million people every month. It's the craziest thing on earth to do. And we've been doing that crazy thing now for 40 years, more than 40 years. And we have now several 100,000 people taking online courses with the college. And they are interested in what it has to teach. And of course, what it has to teach is an invitation into an argument and understanding the bases of the argument on the various sides. We actually think that that is the process that will save the United States of America and its republic. We think that, for example, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were hotly contested, revealed a great truth on which the nation was able finally to act with tragic violence and ultimate success. That is the process. We're going to engage in it today. I'm not going to introduce our speaker, although I'm a great fan of hers because she's wise and faithful and learned in the law, and she does a tremendous good work in the city and elsewhere. I want her to know that I am personally glad that she is here, and I want to ask Jackie Frankel to come up, please, and introduce her.
Cleta Mitchell is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Foley Lardner LLP and a member of the firm's political law practice. She received her BA and her JD from the University of Oklahoma and served from 1976 to 1984 as a member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. She serves on the boards of directors of the National Rifle Association and the Lynde and Harry Bradley Foundation, is chairman of the American Conservative Union Foundation, and has served as president of the Republican National Lawyers Association. She is currently representing several conservative groups singled out for scrutiny by the IRS. Please join me in welcoming Cleta Mitchell.
Well, hello to all of you, and thank you for being here today. I love to be in this room, which is reminiscent of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and Constitution Hall. It is a reminder of what it is we're all about in this country, and so we're very grateful. I'm very grateful to Hillsdale College, to Dr. Bob for inviting me, and to all that you do here in this space. It's quite a wonderful thing that you've done in a very short, and a remarkable thing you've done in a pretty short period of time here in Washington. I want to talk about, we hear about the Irs scandal. I want to tell you, and Dr. Arnn is still back there, so thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. I want to tell you kind of how this came to my attention, how it came to be. People ask me what I do for a living, and I tell them I am the consigliere to the vast right-wing conspiracy. That's what I do. I represent candidates and campaigns and party committees, Republican Party committees. I represent issue organizations, and I represent donors and corporations. You have to understand that politics and policy in this country is a very highly regulated business. It always pains me because I think, did we just completely forget what the founders wrote in the first 5 words of the First Amendment, what George Will says are the 5 most beautiful words in the English language? Congress shall make no law. But the fact of the matter is, it's highly regulated at the state and federal level. So people come to me, they want to do things, and I say, okay, let's see, based on what you want to do, this is where you fit into the legal system. And the very first thing you have to do when somebody says, I want to do, a group of us, we want to do X, you want to start anything in America, at least in the legal side of the marketplace. I don't know how people function in the black market and under the radar. That's just beyond my understanding. But the first thing you have to do is you have to get a bank account, right? To get a bank account, you have to have a number. Everybody in America has a number, again, if you're legal, all of us have Social Security numbers. That's the number we give the bank. That's the number that is on our tax return. If you want to form an entity, if you form an LLC or a partnership or anything, your accountant or you will file a form and you'll check a box and you'll say, this is the kind of entity we want to be. And then that artificial entity doesn't have a Social Security number, it gets what's known as an employer ID number, an EIN. It's the first step toward doing any enterprise in America. Except for one set within the tax code. Now, the tax code defines everything. in America, interestingly enough. And you have to tell where in the tax code you fit. If you're going to be a tax-exempt organization, however, that's the only kind of entity that has to get permission from the government. Why? Because contributions are not taxable as income. That's what that means. Tax-exempt organizations pay a lot of taxes. They pay Social Security taxes, FICA, payroll taxes, they pay sales taxes, some of them pay property taxes. They just don't have to pay taxes on their contributions. That's all that tax-exempt means. But the IRS gets to say, you have to do Mother May I be recognized as a tax-exempt organization. Everybody else, you want to form a partnership or an LLC, you just check the box and go on down the road. You do not have to ask for permission from the government. You file a tax return according to what kind of entity you are. So I've been doing this for a long time. Historically, prior to 2009, we'll say, I think that there might be some correlation between some other things that happened in America in 2009, but I would fill out an application for a client, a group of people who wanted to be a grassroots lobbying organization, a 501c4, social welfare group. It would take maybe 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, to get a 501c3 designation as a charitable educational organization. That would take a little bit longer, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months, and mainly because contributions to those kinds of entities are deductible as charitable contributions. The IRS thinks it's their money. They don't want to give that money up easily, so they ask you a few more questions. But, and when we got questions, if you got questions back from the IRS, what you would get would be questions related to the actual application. I mean, the thing that I want to, it's my first point I want everybody to understand. What got the IRS into this mess in the first place is something that is fundamental to our American way of life, and that is the rule of law. We have for hundreds of years now, operated under a principle that the rule of law means that all of us as citizens are entitled to know what the law is, what's the government, what can it do and not do, how, and to be judged equally based on what the law says and not who we are. The rule of law is that we are a nation of laws, not of men and women. It is that there are objective legal standards. Every agency of the government must treat us in accordance with those standards. What happened with the IRS beginning in 2009, we know it started in 2010, I think it really started in 2009, was that they started treating certain citizens, certain taxpayers, every organization that's subjected to this horrible screening and targeting is a taxpayer. They're defined legally as a taxpayer. And they took certain taxpayers based on their beliefs, based on their philosophy, based on the kinds of things in which they wish to engage, which involve criticizing their government. Let's not forget that. That's the number one thing that these groups wanted to be able to do, was criticize their government. And they took those taxpayers, hundreds of them, and instead of following the rule of law and the very specific multi-page application to become a 501c3 and a multi-page application, hundreds of questions, lots of schedules to become a 501c4, and they took those people, those taxpayers, and they treated them, they said, we're going to treat you differently. We're going to ask you things that have nothing to do with what's on the published application. We're going to give you questions and delay your application and really basically intimidate you. And that they departed from the rule of law. So I had an organization. My first inkling that something had changed was in the fall of 2009. I had an organization that came to me and they wanted just to do grassroots organizing against Obamacare. I want you to think back what was happening. 2009, the fall of 2009. Remember December 2009, Scott Brown is elected. That didn't stop those people. The people's will never seems to matter to them. January, February. It was Obamacare. It was the bailout. It was the stimulus package, all in 2009. So that's what gave rise to the Tea Party movement. And I think that they decided that they needed to try, they being the officials at the IRS and people in power in Washington, that they needed to try to do something to put the brakes on this effort, to criticize and stop Obamacare and the other things that these groups said they wanted to try to do, which was to stop all of this. So we applied in October of 2009 for this group that wanted to just be involved in lobbying against Obamacare. And that is all they did. They lobbied for the extension of the Bush tax cuts a year later, but they were not involved in any political activity at all. And I didn't hear anything in the rest of 2009. Usually, remember, 5 weeks max, maybe 6 weeks. Nothing in all of the spring of 2010. And the first word that I had from the IRS about this organization was in June of 2010, and they asked for copies of all of the ads that had been run by this group against Obamacare. And I called the IRS agent. I refer to them as our parole officer since I have to check in with them periodically. And I said, well, this is really unusual. I said, what is this about? And let me tell you the two interesting things about this. This agent and this application for this group was never in Cincinnati. I was dealing with the Washington office of the IRS from day one, which was odd. And then when I said to him, what is this about? You want all the ads that this group has run against Obamacare? And he said, yes. And I said, what's that about? He said, I want you to understand something. There are people here who do not understand the difference between a 501c3 that can only do a little bit of lobbying and a 501c4 that can spend all of its money on lobbying, all of it. That organization, I provided that in July of 2010. In June of 2011, I wrote them a letter. I said, I have heard nothing from you for a year. The only thing that this organization has done was to lobby against Obamacare. I'm beginning to think the only reason it hasn't been granted its exempt status is because it has opposed this administration. I would find that very disturbing. Within 3 days, I got a call from 3 agents on a conference call calling to assure me that that was not the case. And I said, well, where's our letter of exempt status? It's been almost 2 years. That organization, we didn't hear anything else from the IRS until the spring of last year, and we got one of those letters that they sent to hundreds and hundreds of organizations across the country that had hundreds of questions. There were something like 40 questions, each one having 5 parts, subparts, asking for donors. Who are your donors? Of $2,000 or more, which there's no legal authority for asking for that kind of information. There's a whole different process for that. They ask, who have you associated with? How many meetings have you had? We want a list of every meeting you've had and everyone who's attended every meeting you've had. They asked for True the Vote for Catherine Engelbrecht. They asked every place she had spoken in the last 2 years, who she spoke to, and everybody in the audience. It would be like asking me 2 years from now to say, who of you had attended this meeting at Hillsdale? Asking, are you or any member of your board going to run for office? Have you or any of your family members contemplated running for office? I had already been having this fight with the IRS over 3 or 4 of my clients who had applied for exempt status, and nothing had happened. When we got those letters from the IRS, I put those in a packet, I redacted the names, and I headed to Capitol Hill to see the staffers, the House Ways and Means, and the Senate Finance Committee, and I said, guys, something is going on at the IRS. This is totally out of the norm. They're asking questions and doing things, and they're withholding the application for exempt status for no reason. So fast forward, of course, the IRS commissioner was called over to testify before Congress Doug Shulman in March of 2012 and was asked, and several letters were sent to the IRS. And I had given a list of questions so here's some questions to the staffers that they could ask the IRS, which they did. And the IRS, in the spring of last year, March of last year, said there is no targeting. Doug Shulman told Congress there's no targeting of conservative groups, none whatsoever. And they refused to answer. They didn't provide any of the responses to any of the other questions that had been sent, other than to say nothing is happening. You know, you're totally fabricating this. You guys need to do something else with your lives. And what we know for certain, is that as early as August of 2011, that the Washington office, the IRS Chief Counsel's office, was involved in developing what ultimately became the template for those onerous, burdensome questionnaires that were sent. I have one client, we submitted 2 volumes of paperwork in response to just one of the requests. They asked for every, some things you just said, well, we don't have any way to provide that. They asked for every Facebook posting. They asked for a printout of every page of the website since inception. You know, and the thing that's really frustrating is that so many of these groups are really small mom and pop organizations who literally were found, you know, their annual income was probably less than $5,000. You know, fast forward to this year, we know that they were very involved and knew that everybody in the C-suite or in the commissioner's floor at the IRS, they knew within weeks. If they hadn't known before, they certainly knew within weeks of Shulman's testimony that it was false. Now, I keep wondering why it is that he gets to lie to Congress with impunity, and then I remember, oh, that would have to be enforced by Eric Holder and the Justice Department. I mean, but ask Roger Clemens what happens if you lie to Congress. It hasn't happened to Doug Shulman, but it should. He should be prosecuted because he lied to Congress. And it is a felony to lie to Congress. It's not a felony for them to lie to us, by the way. It's just a felony to lie to them if you're testifying. So fast forward to this year. So Lois Lerner, who is the head of the exempt organizations unit, or was at the time, every year she speaks to a meeting of the tax exempt section of the American Bar Association. And the meeting is held every year the second Friday of May in Washington. And this year she did not speak, but she spoke in person, but she spoke by phone, a conference call, and she planted a question in the audience. A friend, somebody who's written a lot in this arena, and wrote a question, had her ask the question about targeting conservative groups, to which Lois Lerner responds as follows. She says, oh, yes, we found out about that. It was a couple of rogue agents in Cincinnati, and we fixed it. And thus began the lie after lie after lie of the IRS. Every statement the IRS has made since this became public and before has been false. And now, apparently, our job is just to keep proving how everything they say is a lie. I believe, and I have confirmed with people who have worked inside the commissioner's office, they really believed this was a strategy. They really believed that she would say that on a Friday afternoon and that it was old news by Monday. Because guess what? That has been the experience with every one of these other scandals of this administration. So why would they think that the press would actually take one of these things seriously that we're concerned about? And they were completely flummoxed and shocked that the reaction to this, yes, we did target conservatives, was so strong and vehement in the mainstream press. And I have to tell you, I was a little surprised too, and I kept saying, we need to get as much as we can out of this, because at some point the press is going to start remembering that they hate us. and that it's really okay that this happened. And guess what? What is happening? If you figure this happened on Friday, on Monday, when there was just this whirlwind of stories and shock and outrage, so Stephen Miller, the acting commissioner, what does he do on Monday after Lois's little thing on Friday? He writes an op-ed that's published on Tuesday in USA Today, in which he basically denies that anything bad has happened. Except that on Wednesday, the Treasurer Inspector General for Tax Administration, TIGTA, the TIGTA report was released, which documented over nearly 300 groups that we know of that were targeted. And we've gone from there. There are 5 things I really want you to, because I want to leave time for questions, but there are 5 things I really want you to take away, and I have a handout. If you don't have it now, you can pick it up on the way out. But things that I really want you to understand about this scandal. Number 1 is what I said earlier. This is a departure from the rule of law. This is what happens in a banana republic. This is what happened in the former Soviet Union. This is what happens in a totalitarian regime. It is when a bunch of bureaucrats or commissars behind closed doors decide what law it is they're going to create out of whole cloth and how they're going to treat citizens and punish them or withhold government favor, et cetera, et cetera. This scandal is writ large one of the most troubling things to me about the Obama administration, because we've seen it over and over and over again, but it is particularly acute when we're talking about this particular scandal. We all understand the IRS. It reaches into every one of our lives. You can't do anything. You can't open a bank account unless you got a number from the IRS. Start with that. So they departed from the rule of law. It's fundamental to our society, and we cannot let them get away with this. Number 2, that the official position of the IRS regarding this scandal, every single statement they have made has been proven to be false. They started out as 2 rogue agents in Cincinnati. I fired off a letter on the Friday afternoon after Lois made her comments, because I meet monthly with a group of lawyers who do what I do, right and left. This is the one-time conservative and lawyers for conservative groups, lawyers for liberal groups. We meet once a month, and we just talk about things like the FEC and the IRS and the alphabet soup of these agencies and how it affects all of our clients, regardless of what their purpose or mission is. And I had taken copies of these redacted letters a year ago when they first came out to the luncheon and handed them out to all the attorneys, including the liberal attorneys, and I said, have any of your groups gotten any of this? Of course, they never have. They'd never seen any of that. They all thought I was crazy. But let me tell you what, when Lois made her comments, a number of them were there, and they immediately started sending me emails. I wasn't there, and they started sending me emails saying, oh my gosh, Cleta was right. We thought you were just crazy, but you're really right. I said, well, just because we're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get us, but... So I fired off a letter to Lois Lerner and Stephen Miller that afternoon saying, do not issue an apology. Issue my clients letters of determination of exempt status. We've been waiting for years. And we know, and I said, and for you to say that this was 2 rogue agents in Cincinnati is a complete lie, because I knew that another one of my clients in October of 2011, when I talked to the parole officer in Cincinnati, he said, lady, these decisions are all being made in Washington. And I had memorialized that in writing in November of 2011. So I knew that she was lying. When they say that it's over, that's the 3rd thing. This is not in the past tense. It's still going on. I have one client that I can actually share because he gave me permission. It's how I first came to know Dr. Bob and Hillsdale College. A group of people wanted to organize something called the Constitutional Congress to help new members of Congress study the Constitution and understand their constitutional imperatives. That application was filed in March of 2011. We have heard nothing from the IRS until May of 2013. Right after the scandal broke. And now it's what? almost the end of July. We've heard nothing. And guess what? That organization, when we heard from the IRS, guess what they wanted to know? What materials are you going to be using? What copyrights exist for those materials? Please provide copies of the materials that you plan to use. So I just sent them back a copy of the Constitution, and I said, to my knowledge, and I gave them links to websites, and starting with Hillsdale's quite wonderful website on the study of the Constitution. I said, there are a number of universities and organizations that make these materials available free of charge because they want the American people to study the Constitution. But you'd think that having submitted that at the end of May, it wouldn't be too hard to say, okay, fine, here's your letter. I've heard nothing. So it's still going on. And then what they did, which is so infuriating, is that earlier this month, the acting commissioner of the IRS, Daniel Werfel, said, oh, we've come up with a solution. We're going to ask all of these targeted groups. Actually, I learned the other day, only 82 of them sent these letters. So I don't know what's supposed to be going on with the rest of these people who didn't get the letter, saying, if you will make a deal with the government, if you'll make a deal with us, that you will promise, under penalty of perjury, that you will not engage in political activities and expenditures in excess of 40%, including not just your expenditures, but volunteer activities, then we'll give you your exempt status letter. And again, I come back to, where's the authority in the law for that? There's no legal authority for that. And better yet, how many liberal groups have had to make that promise? If the unions would make that promise, I might think about it. But it's making it up as they go along. It's departing from the rule of law and treating people differently in our country based on their viewpoint, their political or philosophical viewpoint. It is an outrage. And then I would say finally, the Democrats on the congressional committees, I mean, it's really hard for me to watch these hearings, but I have to. But they perpetuated several myths. One is that the progressive groups were subject to the same scrutiny. As near as we can tell, there were maybe 7 progressive groups who were reviewed for who pulled for additional scrutiny. It's like going fishing. You catch it, look at it, throw it back in. Well, that's what happened to the progressive groups. None of them got the same kind of oppressive letters. None of them are still having their tax-exempt status held up. Now, they also, most of the reason that they say this happened was because of Citizens United. I don't know if you knew, but Citizens United, I think, causes cancer. Because actually, Citizens United is responsible for about every bad thing that could possibly have happened in the United States since January 2010. Most of these Tea Party groups, as I said, they're tiny little groups. They're not Karl Rove. They're tiny little groups, and they aren't planning to run ads, and they didn't form to be a C4 because of Citizens United. And they didn't, they say, well, there was just this huge influx of applications. Really? If you look at the statute, if you look at the numbers, the statistics, Citizens United was handed down in January 2010. They say, oh, well, there was this big influx. There were actually fewer applications for exempt status for C4 organizations in 2010 than in 2009. And then they say, they're trying to say that 501c4 groups should not be allowed to make any political expenditures. I figure that the left-wing 501c4s will put a stop to that, although they always try to find a way to catch our guys, and they keep operating with impunity. Actually, that's true. I mean, the fact is they could pass that law and then they would just ignore it, and we would be the ones who would abide by the law. But, the main thing I hope that happens next is that, the IRS is doing everything it can do to stall, to not answer questions. They send back documents that are so heavily redacted that you can't even understand what the meaning of the document is. They are using, I'll close with this one thing, and I want to be sure and have plenty of time for questions, but after Watergate, Congress passed a law to say that Section 6103 of the tax code, to say that it was illegal for any taxpayer's confidential information to be inspected or released, disseminated. That was to make sure that whatever we send to the IRS is confidential. And if you're an IRS employee, you're not supposed to just go perusing somebody's information without authorization. The IRS is now using that statute as a shield to protect the IRS employees who have been involved in this scandal, and saying that they cannot release information about the scandal and about individual situations because it would violate Section 6103. And I'll give you the classic example. It's something out of Kafka. I represent the National Organization for Marriage. About a year ago, we realized that the Huffington Post had published our Schedule B, our confidential schedule of donors. The IRS requires that on an organization's Form 990 tax information return that's filed every year, one of the schedules is a schedule that lists the donors who've contributed $5,000 or more. That is not, while you have to disclose that to the IRS, it is not a publicly. The statute also says that you can redact the name and address of the donor for your public inspection copy, because you have to make your 990 available to anyone who asks for it, but you don't have to tell them, you don't have to have in your public inspection copy the list of who your donors are. The IRS has it, but not the public. So the Huffington Post has published NOMS 2008, Form 990, Schedule B, with all of its donors. And through some technological wizardry that I don't begin to understand, our technology person, or NOMS technology person, was able to peel off something that they had put on it somehow and show that it was every document that's filed with the IRS is coded, and it had the official coding. We know that it was the as-filed 990 form. We immediately wrote a letter to the Treasurer Inspector General demanding an investigation. And then we know that the Treasurer Inspector General came out, interviewed the people at NOM, asked for materials, we provided that, and then we heard nothing. So about 3 months later, we sent a letter saying, what's happening? They said, we can't tell you. We said, why can't you tell us? Because 6103 protects the confidentiality, the taxpayer's confidentiality. We said, we're the taxpayer. We have not been able to get anything. We finally filed a FOIA request, and they sent us copies of things that we had filed asking for the investigation and asking where are the results of the investigation. That's their idea of freedom of information. And so we're preparing to file that suit against the IRS for violation of 6103. But one of the things that's happening is that the IRS is using that same process and hiding behind that same statute to keep from having to provide information to the House Ways and Means Committee and to the Government Oversight and Reform Committee in conducting this investigation. I think Friday, the House Ways and Means Committee issued a statement and a pie chart. The IRS says that it has X million documents responsive or pertinent to this investigation. They've released like 0.3% to date, and those are very heavily redacted. So, you know, I think the President and this administration is hoping that we'll all lose sight of this, lose interest. The media will go on down the road. The IRS can stall and keep anybody from paying attention to this. I'm hoping like crazy that doesn't happen, but it's tough, and we have slow going. But it's so important that we not let this go unanswered, and that the people be held accountable. And the final thing is, I will say, then I'll be happy to answer questions about it, is that I do represent True the Vote as well. We have filed suit in federal court here in D.C. We're preparing to file suit on behalf of NOM. We think that that it will be a corollary, that, and there are a couple of other cases, that these lawsuits, hopefully if we can keep them in court and get the discovery and get maybe some judicial interpretation of 6103, that it was passed to protect the taxpayers and not the IRS, that maybe we can ultimately get to the truth. So with that, I thank you, and I'd be glad to stop and answer questions. Thank you. Yes, Mark, I think do you have a microphone? Okay, you want to come over here?
Hi, Cleta, great speech. Thank you so much for what you're doing. My question is about whether you know anything about the audits of Republican donors. And just to let you know, Martha Bonetta is here. Martha is was on Fox, Greta Van Sustern's show Thursday night. She was in a dispute with her county and the Piedmont Environmental Council. She got an IRS audit that was disclosed to a county official before she got notice of the audit, which under 6103 is a civil violation and potentially a felony. And 10 days after she went public with her audit, her house was vandalized. So these people are very serious in what they're doing. But do you know anything more about the audits?
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I'm familiar with the case. Mark brought it to my attention, and thank you for what you're doing, and sorry for everything you've been through. This is, this citizen who has the temerity to think that she can use her own property for the purposes for which she wants to use it. Where did you get that idea, lady? One of the things that I have been urging, and I think that the House Ways and Means Committee has issued a public statement, and in fact, Chairman Camp at the very first Ways and Means Committee hearing said that they are also going to look at and investigate the audits, the audit division, not just the exempt organizations division, but the audit division. Look, I'm hearing stories. You can imagine, people are calling me and emailing me about audits that I think there were an inordinate number of audits of Romney donors and fundraisers. There were audits of conservative organizations. And there's a common theme that I keep hearing, which is that people will say to me, my accountant said he's been doing this for 30 years and he's never seen them behave quite like this. I hear that over and over and over. So that these agents of the IRS are not conducting themselves in the same way that people who are used to dealing with them have come to expect. So that tells me that these audits have come about in not appropriate ways. And I'm sure along the lines of this sharing of information with local officials, it happened to you. It happened also to Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, where a false tax lien was put on property she had sold a year earlier, and then all of this information was given to the state attorney general, who's the son of Joe Biden. It's really quite breathtaking, and it really does make you stop and think, oh my gosh, are we really still in America? It's really quite frightening. Yes, sir.
One storyline you hear a great deal in Washington is this idea of, well, there are two different parties with, two different worldviews, and bipartisanship is good, and we're taught that in civics class growing up. So we come with that idea, but yet the picture you've painted is one radically different. It's really one of a side that's actually mendacious and a tissue of lies, and really it sounds evil. Do you see it in quite the stark terms, or?
Yes, I do.
Wow.
I think I do see it in those stark terms, because I think that there are people who think that, look, if you look at, True the Vote is the perfect example. True the Vote is an organization from Houston, Texas, that was founded in 2010. They really grew out of the Tea Party movement, and there was a group of citizens, and they decided that what they thought they could do for America is they would go be poll watchers. They would be poll observers. They would observe the election process. I mean, we have 3 federal agencies that we pay for to send observers to elections all around the world. I just got a report from the International Foundation for Electoral Systems last week. We just sent a team, we're sending a team to Zimbabwe. And what are they doing? They're looking to see if people are properly registered. They're looking to see if those who are voting are eligible to vote, if there is corruption in the casting of the ballots. We pay for that in Zimbabwe. Well, it ought to be okay for volunteers to do it in Houston, don't you think? Except that what they made the mistake of doing is they made the mistake of being really smart and effective. And so while you have dozens of these groups on the left, all of whom have 501c3 status, Project Vote, which is a very partisan organization that President Obama used to work for, they're a 501c3 organization. True the Vote applied for its 501c3 status in July of 2010. We still don't have it. We've sued them. But let me tell you what they've done. They created with volunteers, they created a software package. I mean, these people talk about things I don't even understand. I'm way too old to understand what they're talking about. They created with volunteer people a software capability, a functionality where you can download the voter rolls in any jurisdiction in America, and there's an overlay against Google Maps so that you can tell whether there are 20 people registered at a vacant lot. Well, how wonderful is that? Oh no, this is considered a complete threat. So guess what happens to the president of True the Vote? Within a very short time, within 6 months after they applied for their tax-exempt status, Catherine Engelbrecht and her husband had an IRS audit. Their company, they have a small manufacturing company, IRS audit. They were visited by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms twice. They were visited by the FBI 7 times. They were visited by OSHA. They were visited by the Texas Environmental Quality Commission on a referral from the EPA. Now, is there anyone in this room who thinks that that's coincidental? I mean, I watch NCIS. There are no coincidences. So, do I think that this is evil? I do. I think that this organization has been targeted because it is so effective, and that they, beginning as early as the fall of 2010, Bob Bauer, who at the time was Obama's counsel to his campaigns and counsel to the DNC, DCCC, DSCC, wrote a memo about how dangerous True the Vote was. Then he went over to become White House counsel. Yes?
Yes. What do you think the chances of a select committee being formed are?
Well, I wish I could tell you I thought they were really good. I have recommended that to the council, to the speaker, mainly because there needs to be a group of people and staff who are able to share information and focus just on this. It is too big and too important, and the IRS is trying to do they're making such an effort to deflect and dissemble and delay and deny that I think we have to figure out how can we be more strategic in terms of making sure we get to the bottom of this. I worry that it might be a little too late because now the Democrats have regrouped and would probably stop it. There was a point in time where they probably would have voted to do that just because they, at the time, were still trying to pretend like they cared about this kind of horrible activity. So I don't know. I'm not very hopeful.
Going forward, other than investigating the IRS, what can an alternative system look like that would allow for less bureaucratic
Well, I think that's a really good question. I basically think that what should happen is we should just abandon this Mother May I approach. Why should the government get to pass judgment on whether or not an organization is or is not able to operate as a grassroots lobbying organization? I mean, the only conceivable argument I might be willing to have with someone might be over 501c3 organizations because contributions are tax deductible, which is not true for any of the other. There are 29 categories of 501c groups. But I would also just argue that if what you did was just let people form and file, and then they have to file a tax information return, just like you do in business. I mean, you don't have to ask the government's permission to form an LLC. You file your tax return for that type of entity, and it's subject to audit. Now, I do think, and actually this is not my idea, this is Michelle Easton's idea from the Clearview Loose Policy Institute, which was subjected to one of these audits. She said, I think we'd all feel better if they did a public lottery and just said, okay, here's how the audits are gonna take place. We're just gonna do a public lottery or some kind of random system so that there was literally no human judgment call about who's subject to audit. But if you know that your number could come up, then you want to make sure that you've done everything right, because then they can come in and look at everything. But I do not think that organizations ought to have to ask the government's permission, and I don't think there's much that we can do to try to fix this problem by writing a bunch more rules and regulations about what is and isn't political activity. And particularly when I hear the acting commissioner of the IRS, and I have IRS agents, and I have my own experience telling me that these people do not know the difference between lobbying and political. Those are two different things. They're not interchangeable. They have separate legal definitions, and they were conflating the two and still are. I have no confidence, and I think this is protected First Amendment activity. We should not have to ask the government's permission to engage in it. Yes.
At the very beginning of this, when this scandal went public,
Hey, Greg.
like the second day,
We want to make sure we record you for posterity.
perhaps the second day that this scandal went public, the potential and very likely involvement of the Treasury Employees Union came out.
Yes.
And we know that the members of Congress that are working on this to read the newspapers, we know that they're aware of it. And yet that word, that title, has not appeared in anything related to this scandal, any of the official investigation so far. I'm hoping that you can tell us that they intend to eventually, in their extremely fine-grained working up to the top, I'm hoping that you can tell us that they do intend to investigate and report on the role of the union in this whole thing.
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think the difficulty we have at the moment is that who would know if you see the documents they've gotten back from the IRS, they redact everybody's name, everybody's title. So you could have names of union officials and their titles, and who would know? Because they've redacted all of it. So. Well, it is interesting. I had a long conversation with the staff about there are these very strict rules about depositions that are conducted by the House of Representatives. If you have a deposition, if you depose somebody, you can only depose someone if if you have the chairman and the ranking member present. You know how hard that is? It would be, I would be dead and gone 5 lifetimes before they got through. So what they're doing is they're doing interviews. Now, it is a felony to lie during the course of a federal investigation, whether it is to an agency or to a member of Congress. So they are tantamount to being under oath. They can be prosecuted. But then come back to this. The big difficulty is you've got Eric Holder as the head of the Justice Department. Remember when the president announced on May 15th, I'm really mad about this scandal. This is really terrible. I'm going to have the FBI and Eric Holder's going to investigate. Really? You'd think they might have called me by now. You'd think they might have called one of my clients by now. We have seen no evidence of any FBI investigation to try to get to the bottom of this. Well, they were Johnny on the spot to interview Catherine Engelbrecht about who was attending her meetings from the domestic terrorism unit, I might add, which tells you they consider the Tea Party movement to be terrorists. They do, and they have made that pretty clear. But, you know, look, I don't disagree with you. I think that one of the things we ought to do is we ought to say that IRS employees not be allowed to join a union. I don't think we should have unions in the IRS. I mean, somehow we have to find a way to shrink the size of this agency. That's what I keep saying to the members on the Hill. I say, you know, look, this is everything. This is showing the American people that when we talk about shrinking the size of government, we're not just talking about pushing Granny over the cliff in her wheelchair. We're talking about shrinking the size of an agency that is a threat to the civil liberties of every American. And, you know, but I think one of the things we have to do, I agree with you, we got to get to the bottom of the role of the unions in this. Yes. Yes.
Hi, Ken Masugi. In a Washington Post column, you suggested that withdrawing Tom Perez's nomination
I did.
to labor, which I thought was really brilliant.
It didn't happen.
No, alas. But two questions. He will head up the Office of the Federal Contract Compliance. And
Yes.
so one question would be the possible abuse of civil rights enforcement along the lines of what's going on in the IRS. And the other thing is, why don't you think the Republicans made as an objection to Perez the virtual criminalization of using criminal background checks in employment?
Well, those are really good questions. You know, I get frustrated with our guys. I know they mean well, but they sometimes strike me as not very strategic. And the argument that they made about Perez, they got all, when Tom Perez is, just for those of you who don't know who he was the head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. And he just was confirmed in that deal a couple weeks ago as the Secretary of Labor. And in February of this year, the Inspector General of the Justice Department issued a report saying that under Tom Perez and the Department of Civil Rights, the Office of Civil Rights of the Justice Department, that decisions were being made based on the basis of philosophy, political philosophy, and ideology, rather than based on the law. So he just got promoted. And the guy, and you know, they made a valiant fight, sort of, against him, but they decided to focus on a deal a really sick thing that he had done with the city of St. Paul, but they did not focus on a lot of the things that I thought they should have focused on, and that's one of them. And you know, you make a very good point, this whole federal contracting issue. Remember, one of the things that the Obama administration proposed not long after Citizens United was that anybody who wanted a federal contract would have to tell who they'd made political contributions to as a means of, quote, disclosure. Let me tell you, you need to understand when the left talks about disclosure, they are not talking about transparency. They are looking for a target list, that both friends and enemies. So yeah, it's, you know, Tom Perez worries me a lot. He was awful where he was. He's going to be awful where he is now. Yes.
Well, first off, as a resident of Cincinnati, I would like to thank you for putting to rest the myth that this is all my city's fault. It's been really annoying to me, and I honestly think it's tarnished the place's image. So thank you for that.
That's a good point. The Chamber of Commerce ought to, you know, come out and say something.
My question is, one of the objections the founders defended the Constitution against from the Anti-Federalists was the possibility for the sort of machinery of the federal government to be put to use against political opponents, especially during election times. And I think the arguments that they made were pretty convincing, but do you think that the targeting that we saw and continue to see, especially as it sort of ramped up in the wake of the 2012 election, and as is starting to emerge, actually did have a definite impact on those organizations' ability to advocate for the causes they wanted. Do you think that represents an instance of that sort of machinery being put to use? And if so, how do you stop a machine that sort of seems to operate itself? And in the way that a bureaucracy does from doing that when it's sort of its own creature?
You know, you ask a really important and very fundamental question, which really, I think, goes to something that conservatives and grassroots citizens all over the country are asking is how do we get control back of our government? Because right now it seems that the government is out of control, and we send these great new people to Congress and they seem unable to do anything about it. What you have to remember is that all of this has been codified over 80 plus years. I mean, basically the modern federal government has been built over almost a century by people who fundamentally disagree with us. And so when we send people to Washington and to Congress, we're sending people who are just trying to put their fingers in the dike. And I don't think that we've ever stopped as the Republican Party's hopeless. I mean, they just make me crazy. But we have not been strategic in saying, what do we have to do to pull the props out and to start unwinding some of these things that have built up for literally almost a century. And just this week I was telling Dr. Bob that, this week the House is doing the Stop Government Abuse Week. So guess what? Have any of you heard of that? And they have about, 30 different pieces of legislation, and they're going to pass all these things. And then they're going to go home, and no one will know. And it's small ball. It's all small ball. Pick 2 or 3 things and talk about it for a month or 6 weeks. They think if they do something in one of those chambers that we all know. And if you don't know, so you try to talk about that. Well, we passed that 3 weeks ago. Really? Well, you know what? I have a life to live. I actually don't know if you don't do a better job of telling us. So, look, I think that you asked the fundamental question. And I will tell you, you go back and read the Anti-Federalists. I don't want to be the one to say this, but I will. An awful lot of the things they worried about have come to pass. An awful lot of the things the Anti-Federalists said, if you do this, this is what will happen, has happened. So how do we unwind that? It's not going to be easy, but we have to rebalance it. We just have to save our country.
And we have time for one more question.
Okay, how about over there?
Thank you, Pat Span. I wonder if you have any hope that the nearest IG is the Treasury Department IG, that anything positive will come out of their efforts.
Well, I think that Russell George gets a lot of credit for the extent of the fallout from his report already. Now he's going to look at the auditing. He's going to look into your case and other cases. And I think that, one of the things that's happened is that the Democrats on the committees are realizing that he is making headway, and now they're trying to discredit him. So they said, well, you didn't talk about the targeting of progressive groups. He said, well, we actually did. We looked exactly at that, and we looked at the statistical analysis, and based on the random sampling that we took, the statistical analysis is that about 30% of progressive groups that said progressive or progress in their name, were pulled, looked at, and then released back into the stream. But I think they're going to do everything they can to try to discredit him because they see that he is actually moving forward on a number of fronts and making some progress. But remember this, when he conducted that investigation, which took more than a year, the supervisor from the Exempt Organizations Unit was sitting in on all the meetings, and he had no documents. It was all just conversation, interviews. He had no emails, no memoranda, none of that. And so that is one of the things that the congressional committees are trying to get, are the memoranda and the documentation that were not provided to the Inspector General. But we just have to be vigilant, as always. Talk to your members, and thank you all for your interest and for coming. Appreciate it.